12 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I looked at on the wire this week. The first guy, Joey Sly, the Washington Commanders. So Joey Sly, we know he was a good kicker in his Carolina Panther days, but this season he started off the season slow, but the last few weeks here, he's been on the fantasy radar now. Week 10 at Philly, 19 fantasy points, and Week 11 at Houston with 12. So right here, Week 12, a good matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. I give up the 10th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right here, this Commander team not finishing a lot of drives in the end zone, and that's given Sly opportunity. So with 2 weeks now with 31 fantasy points in that time, available in 90% of fantasy leagues, with a good matchup coming up in Week 12 and Week 13 versus Atlanta and the Giants here. I think Sly could help fantasy owners in 12-team leagues or deeper, and he's definitely an ad this week. The next guy, Brett Maher of the Dallas Cowboys. So Maher had the best game of his career, including hitting a 50 and a 60-yarder in the Week 12 victory, a blowout victory as well, 40-3, a shocker versus the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota. So the last few games here for Maher: Week 8 versus Chicago, 7 fantasy points. Week 10 at Green Bay, 4. Week 11 in Minnesota, 22. And Week 12 here, a good matchup on Thanksgiving versus New York Giants that give up the 4th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So this Cowboy offense looking like it might start to get things going the last few weeks here with 28 or more points since Dak Prescott's been back in the lineup. I know Maher, he was down to extra points over the last few weeks, but right here he had a couple big ones obviously in that game versus Minnesota. So right now only available in 43% of fantasy leagues. This is probably the last week here owners could go out there and get Maher on their team. The next guy's Will Lutz of the New Orleans Saints. So Will Lutz, he's been on this list a lot this season here, but available still in 60% of fantasy leagues here. So right now he's getting an opportunity. He's scoring at least 5-10 fantasy points weekly for fantasy owners. And once again here, he's got a matchup at the Niners where they're probably not going to find the end zone a lot, is the Saint team, and they're going to have to settle for field goals. So the last few games here for Lutz: Week 8 versus the Raiders, 6. Week 9 versus Baltimore, 7. Week 10 at Pittsburgh, 5. And Week 11 versus the Rams, 10. So right here, Week 12, not the greatest matchups on paper at San Francisco. But like I mentioned, I think they could get in field goal range a few times here for Will Lutz. And this offense has been hit or miss so far this season here with New Orleans. They drive down the field, but they do turn the ball over a lot. But at San Francisco, they're going to have to try to put points on the board to keep up with them. So right here, Will Lutz, I like as an ad this week. The next kick is Chase McLaughlin of the Indianapolis Colts. So McLaughlin, he's been on the list a few times as well on and off this season. And he's just another guy that puts up fantasy points, and he's available in 92% of fantasy leagues here. It's Chase McLaughlin. So the last few games here for him: Week 8 versus Washington, 11. Week 9 at New England, 4. Week 10 at Vegas, 9. And Week 11 versus Philly, 12. So right here, solid ball games back-to-back weeks. And Week 12 here, a good ball game versus the Steelers coming into town on Monday Night Football, where they could give up a lot of fantasy points to kickers as well. We just watched Evan McPherson come off a 17-point game in Week 11. So right now, McLaughlin out there, like I said, in 92% of fantasy leagues, and a good matchup coming up. He's definitely a kicker to get, because this team as well don't finish a lot of drives in the end zone is Indianapolis. And the 5th and final kicker I look to get on the wire this week's Ryan Suckup of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So obviously the Buccaneers coming off a bye week here, and now Suckup, he was dropped in a lot of leagues for teams filling out team needs. Available right now in tons of fantasy leagues, 66% here, Suckup. So the last few games here for him: Week 7 at Carolina, 3. Week 8 versus Baltimore, 10. Week 9 versus the Rams, 12. And Week 10 versus Seattle, 3 in that one. So right here, available, like I said, in a lot of fantasy leagues at 66%. We know this Tampa Bay offense can score the football, and I think this offense, after the bye week here, for some reason, is going to get stronger, and they're going to figure things out after the struggles have come early in the season. So right now, on a good offensive Suckup, available in tons of leagues. Pretty good matchup at Cleveland that gives up the 13th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. He's a kicker to add this week, so that's a few kickers I looked at on the wire here for Week 12 of the fantasy football season.